the criticism of the Prime Minister has always been that he doesn't have this kind of feral sense of where he is politically. And when you get to complicated issues in the Middle East with his old mate Lord Hermer on one shoulder and perhaps, people in the sort of defence and diplomatic world on the other saying, this is important to us too, I don't think he really quite knows which way to jump.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Lucy Dunn, and today I'm joined by James Heale and our new political editor, Tim Shipman. In this week's Spectator magazine, Tim has given us the inside track on how the Labour government is dealing with Iran, Donald Trump, and the prospect of escalating conflict in the Middle East. Tim, it's your first cover piece for The Spectator, so it's an exciting time, and there's been a litany of scoops. So I think, let's just jump right in from, chronologically when Keir Starmer found out about Israel's assault on Iran. Can you tell us a bit about what the process was like, in private as well as what we saw in public?
Yeah, I think they had a decent inkling of what was coming. They had done a wargaming exercise that the Foreign Office led last Monday, 4 days before it happened. And I've got people inside saying they'd been expecting Israel to do something more aggressive against Iran probably since December. So they've been looking around wondering what to do. But, when push came to shove, we weren't really involved in any of it. Back in October, when there were, Iran was sending 200 missiles towards Israel, the RAF was involved in helping to try and shoot down some of those. This time around, that's not the case, and there's lots and lots of reasons for that. I think Starmer, the main thrust of my piece is that Starmer, was getting quite good plaudits for his handling of foreign affairs for a long time, but I think Foreign Affairs are now presenting with a series of problems, some of which are economic, which threaten to blow up everything Rachel Reeves has announced in the spring statement and the spending review. But I think the left of the Labour Party is getting much more agitated about Israel in general and the Middle East. And I think his hands are a little bit more tied politically than they were before. So, and then, of course, the figure of Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, who Spectator readers and viewers will be very familiar with. He seems to be saying, well, the legality of us getting involved would depend on proving that Iran was about to attack Israel. Unclear whether that was actually the case if you listen to the legal advice, I'm told. And I think if Britain was to get involved, we'd have to show a direct threat to our own resources in the region. Now, Iran has issued those threats, but people I've spoken to who've seen the legal advice say that the Attorney General clearly has grave concerns about us getting heavily involved in any offensive action against Iran.
Mm-hmm. I think actually on that note, James, we've talked a lot about Richard Hermer over the last couple of months, and since he's been Attorney General, he seems to have quite influence actually over some of the choices the Labour government seems to be making. Is that sort of your reading of things?
Yes, certainly. And of course, when we had the cabinet composition last July, who was the only person other than Thangam Debonnaire who lost her seat who wasn't kept from the shadow cabinet? Well, it was the Attorney General. Keir Starmer gave, on the very first day he was Prime Minister, a peerage and the job of Attorney General to Richard Hermer, who's known for many years. And I think that's a reflection very much of the Labour government's intention of making the rule of law, the restoration of the rule of law, they see it, after the Conservatives, one of the cornerstones of this government, and hence the early commitment to never leave the European Court of Human Rights, the Convention on Human Rights. What we've seen in the last couple of days, as Tim talks about there, is the pressures in terms of Iran and the Middle East, but also we've seen a number of sort of rising stars from the new intake, the Labour intake, talk about the need to reform the Convention. You have people like Mike Tapp producing a video talking about the need to look at some of the exemptions which are keeping people who've committed crimes here from being deported. You've also seen a joint op-ed in the Times by Jake Richards and Dan Tomlinson, who I expect to see future ministers in the government. And clearly there's this discussion and debate around the rule of law in different fields, be it sort of domestic tribunals and immigration or foreign conflicts as well. So I think that the familiar spectacle of Richard Hermer, what was it, a fortnight after his comments about opponents of the ECHR being talking about sort of context of 1930s Germany, I think he's going to very much be a running sore of this government.
Yeah, I think, going back to your piece, I think what I found really fascinating was when you talked about the government's priority to ensure that the UK embassy remained in Tehran. Can you tell us a wee bit about why they're so focused on this?
Well, the Americans and the Canadians do not have embassies in Tehran. The Brits do. When it comes to espionage in the Middle East, the Israelis are obviously the best at it, but the Brits have a lot of historic kind of role there, and we've always been sort of along with the French, kind of okay at that stuff. The Americans don't have a presence on the ground. That's very difficult. And so when you talk to officials, they're like, it's very important for us to keep the embassy open because of the people who work in that embassy, and that those who don't have embassies would be very glad if we kept that embassy open too. So I think that means, not completely terminally falling out with the Iranians. Bluntly, there's assets on the ground, there's assets in the regime. I suspect not very many. People tell me that our visibility is poor, but that means that they're desperate to hang on to any kind of intel that they are getting. And if you've got no one who can meet those assets or pick up their blast transmissions of the stuff that they've got hold of, then life gets a bit more problematic. And there's a lot of euphemistic nods and winks, but that's basically what that's all about. And actually, this happened before. If you remember, there was a situation with Chinese diplomats here threatening Chinese nationals. And again, I remember at the time that happened, people said, well, look, we're not going to kick them out. We're going to make clear that we know who they are. And actually, I think most of those who were involved were withdrawn by the Chinese government themselves. But if you start kicking people out, they start kicking our people out. And actually, again, Beijing, very difficult environment to operate in, as is Tehran. And actually, the sort of secret story that, you don't want our intel officers accidentally kicked out, because some of them will be operating under non-official cover, and they kick out the people who are running the agents, then you've got a big hole in your intelligence gathering capability, and it actually governs quite a lot of stuff that the government does. They don't like talking about it. People have been a little freer than usual this week.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I thought, and James, I suppose Tim's already mentioned it, but Starmer has so far in his tenure as Prime Minister come across better on international affairs as opposed to domestically. It seems as though obviously this might be a turning point for him. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the key point in terms of foreign affairs is partly Ukraine, and obviously I think British public opinion is resolutely behind that. That's both a cause that has sort of right and left appeal in different senses. It was a Boris Johnson issue. It's something that Keir Starmer was keen to make up the gap in terms of credibility on defence and polling, and I think certainly he's presented himself quite effectively as a resolute defender of Kiev's interests. The danger is, as Tim was saying there, is when the shift goes to the Middle East, a much more vexed question. And I think it's one that touches on a number of Labour MPs' neuroses, biases and interests. And clearly, I think what Tim does nicely in the piece this week is talk about the relationship between sort of domestic politics and world issues. So, for instance, he talks about Hamish Falconer, another person newly made minister in July last year, and how he's positioning himself in the Parliamentary Labour Party. I think that does show that it's going to be difficult in terms of what this government's doing to have the kind of clout abroad it wants to have, while also keeping domestic opinion with the Labour Party in order at home, and it's only going to get more difficult. And all these things are related. A difficult spending review, welfare bill, for instance, might encourage more rebellion on issues around Gaza or vice versa. So I think that Tim is right to say that up until now foreign affairs has been the thing he's most interested in. I understand the Prime Minister is much more concerned, for instance, on cabinet committees about foreign affairs than economic affairs, something he has had far less of his role despite being the First Lord of the Treasury. That could well change, and we've got the big NATO summit coming up next week. We're also going to have the security review, which Tim writes about in this week's magazine cover, and so I think that for a variety of reasons it certainly looks as though the sort of Love Actually routine might sort of come to an end.
I think it also reveals a lot about Starmer himself, because I think on Ukraine he kind of instinctively knew what the right thing to do was, and he was prepared to act quickly and decisively on that. And I think while some in his party didn't like it, Starmer was very clear from the beginning that he wanted not to fall out with Trump, that he wanted to try and get us preferential trade access, that he was going to go and have his disagreements in private, and he's handled that relationship reasonably well, I think most people would say. On the Middle East, I think he is also lacking that kind of instinctive feel for how to do it. And I've got a quote at the end of this piece where one of the people who's been involved in the response to the Iranian situation said to me, there's a range of opinion, the Foreign Secretary's at one end of it, Lord Mandelson's at the other. If you can tell me where the Prime Minister is, I'd like to know, because it's very unclear. Now, that may have been clearer in the Cobra meeting that came after I'd filed this piece, which Starmer himself chaired on Wednesday. But, the criticism of the Prime Minister has always been that he doesn't have this kind of feral sense of where he is politically. And when you get to complicated issues in the Middle East with his old mate Lord Hermer on one shoulder and perhaps, people in the sort of defence and diplomatic world on the other saying, this is important to us too, I don't think he really quite knows which way to jump, to be honest.
And often there isn't a sort of right or wrong answer. It's often shades of grey with the Middle East, So as Tim says there, I think that he is sort of trying to feel his way. And actually, how much role are we playing in this compared to, for instance, what happened last year? It seems to be far more limited role. And I think it's rather striking that given this crisis, I think the last words of the Prime Minister as of this morning were about Tuesday when he said that America wasn't going to intervene, and then he had sort of all caps letters on Truth Social by the President being like unconditional surrender. So I think it's one where he's definitely not making the running perhaps as the way someone in his party would like him to be.
I think sticking with the Middle East, what was again really interesting, you sort of talked about the pressure on the Labour government, particularly about toughening their stance on Israel, coming not just from backbenchers but also people within government too. Do you get the sense that there's a pressure is growing, or are the sort of dissenting voices simply getting a bit more vocal?
I think they're growing in confidence because, as James rightly observed, there's sort of rebellion going on a range of subjects. You've got quite a lot of Labour MPs who are wondering whether they'll hold their seats at the next election, and that means that they don't feel like they've got a great deal to lose. Reform is doing so well that in a lot of places people with slender majorities are thinking, well, I'm only here. I might only be here for 4 or 5 years, in which case I certainly want to be true to myself. And these are issues, particularly on Gaza, which really, fire the emotions of a lot of people on the left. And I think, so in a sense, it's flushed more to the surface, but I think they're sort of feeling like they're able to speak out, and that the events are making it possible to speak out. The balancing act the government's got to strike is, I spoke to someone senior in the government earlier this week who tried to explain where we're coming from on this and sort of said, well, look, this is a multi-front war in the Middle East, and on some fronts we think Israel needs to restrain itself, brackets Gaza, and on others where clearly there is an existential threat to Israel as a result of Iran's nuclear program, that, Britain, I think their instinct is to give them rather more leeway and be more supportive. But that's quite a difficult argument to make when you've got a lot of people in your own party who take a slightly binary view of these things. David Lammy, went off to the House of Commons and said, well, the Ayatollah has said he wants to destroy Israel, and this would be the means of doing it. And it was kind of explained to me that, there were quite a lot of new MPs who maybe needed to hear this. One of them said to me, it was Janet and John does the Middle East. It's a kind of, a reference for those people a bit older than either of you. But, I think spelling out the simple facts of life will potentially put the leadership at odds with some of those MPs.
Yeah, I think that scepticism in Israel is much more driving here than kind of pro-Ayatollah sentiment, and he said it's all pro-Iranian. That is the difficulty, and I do think most Labour MPs obviously would love a stronger line in terms of Gaza. They think they're pretty horrified what's happening there, but on Iran, this is very different, and this is the issue around shades of grey. Netanyahu is clearly doing stuff in Gaza which most of the British government and in terms of ministers certainly think is reprehensible, but equally they're also doing what Merz, the German leader, said on Tuesday was the necessary work of taking out the Ayatollah's nuclear capabilities in Iran. So this is the issue, it's a constantly evolving one. And what Starmer's trying to do is, for instance, sanction some of the hardline ministers in the Israeli government while also taking care to sort of be in the loop and helpful on different issues. So it's a much more transactional one. And as Tim talks about in terms of the upcoming security review, it's going to be very, very difficult for, I think, some people in Labour to get their heads around the fact that we would love to work in a sort of multilateral world where we walk dealing with people we like, but actually, as Mrs. Thatcher said of meeting Gorbachev, he's a man with whom we could do business. We will have to do business with certain individuals and not the most sort of what shall I say, charming chaps in order to get things done. And Iran is one example of that. And I think that that's been the hard lesson for some in the PLP to have to take.
Yeah, I think sort of, looking forward, you talk about, I suppose, at the end of your piece that Starmer does have this decision in front of him about whether or not he will, join the US and Israel in taking military action against Iran. Do you have any further sense of where Starmer is at with that just now, or is that still
I think it's still fluid. I think it's still up for debate. I think there's obviously a range of possibilities. You could do. It's very unlikely we would do nothing, because that would be problematic with the Americans. There's a question about what we can usefully do. I mean, my understanding is that while yes, we were involved in helping defend Israel back in October, I don't think our contribution was particularly meaningful. So you can see a the kind of aerial assets we have in the Middle East that are often useful. We've got a lot of kind of spy planes and eyes in the sky and those kind of, where you can assist strike aircraft from other countries in doing what they're doing, and in monitoring incoming fire from the Iranians. Potentially you can see a role for the Brits in that. My guess is we'll do the bare minimum that allows us to not fall out with the President of the United States. I suspect this is not a cabinet or a government that particularly wants to put itself out there, particularly when you've got an Attorney General that's saying, oh, this could be problematic, chaps, because there's a lot of people in the Labour Party who can remember the Iraq War and the situation they had with the Attorney General there, who it looked like was sort of had his arm twisted into saying things were more legal than he perhaps thought they were. So, and Hermer is the kind of person who will not hold back from saying publicly what he thinks, as we've seen in quite spectacular terms in recent weeks. He's a very self-confident chap who is not backward about coming forward. So while Lord Goldsmith in 2003 was hiding away in a bunker hoping nobody knew what he was writing down, you can be pretty sure that Richard Hermer will come and tell us all. He may even come on Coffee House Shots, you never know. We can but ask.
I spoke to someone in Labour who said that there's a sort of spectrum. I think Suella Braverman as an Attorney General would be at more political end, shall we say. Lord Hermer is very much the opposite end of the legal one, not particularly helpful. I think someone in Labour would like an Attorney General who sort of Goldilocks style struck the balance somewhere in the middle.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, Tim, and thank you for listening.